Hi everyone, Kim Canetta here, President of the East Brunswick Arts Coalition, to introduce to you our second episode to our Conversations with virtual series, where we connect everyone with the various arts and culture organizations in East Brunswick. The first one was our Playhouse 22's Adam Neary, and today we are speaking with Howard Schmidt, Vice President and Secretary of East Brunswick's Historical Society. Introductions aren't needed for the fabulous host, Maureen Berzok, editor of TAPinto East Brunswick. Thank you again for participating in this series. And we have Howard Schmidt from East Brunswick Historical Society. He's a longtime resident of East Brunswick, living here for about 50 years. He's a graduate of Rutgers University with a bachelor's degree in history and from Seton Hall School of Law with a JD degree. Howard had a legal career for 45 years in New Jersey, 34 years in private practice, and 11 years in the governmental agencies, and he retired in 2017. He has been involved in various community organizations over a number of years and has been with East Brunswick's Historical Society since 2014. Thank you, Howard, for taking the time to share with the community a little bit about yourself and the Historical Society. And now I hand it over to you, Maureen.
Good afternoon, Howard Schmidt. This is Maureen Berzok. I am the editor of TAPinto East Brunswick and the fastest pencil in East Brunswick. And we're here today with Howard Schmidt, who has served our community both as a member of the planning board and various committees in town. And he is here today to speak about the East Brunswick Historical Society. And since Howard and I have lived through a lot of history, I'm sure he's going to have a lot to tell us. Howard, you've lived here in East Brunswick for 50 years. Okay, you're not from East Brunswick. What made you come here?
No. Well, yeah, 50 years, it seems like a long time, and I guess it is. But at that time, in 1971, we were, a young couple with a small family, and we were looking for a house. And my wife and I are both from North Jersey, and the prices were high. So the realtors sent us down to Middlesex County, and we hooked up with a real estate agent here. And at that time, in the 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of building going on here. There was a lot of construction. The prices were right, and we were on a limited budget. And East Brunswick had a decent reputation. And we wound up buying a house here in 71, our first house.
And so you've had a couple of houses here. What made you stay in East Brunswick?
Well, we stayed here. We were in our first house 3 years, and then some new homes were being built where we're living right now, which were bigger and they were nicer. And we figured, well, let's now would be a good time to make a move. So we moved into our current house. We're still in the same house. And, the schools were good. We made some friends here, and we started to put down roots. And I was working in Middlesex County, so it was convenient for us to stay here. And we did. And we're still here.
Well, you said you were working in Middlesex County. What was your job, Howard? Are you still working?
Well, no, I'm retired now. I was an attorney for 45 years. I started practicing in 1972 with a firm in Edison. Mm-hmm. And I was with them, and then I was with another firm in Sayreville for a few more years. And then I opened my own office in 1979. And I had my own office until 2002, when I took a position with a governmental agency, and I stayed with the government until 2017, and then decided that was enough, and I retired in 2017.
I retired in 2015, and here we are, Howard. Okay, here we are together, still working, right? Now,
yeah.
You became a member of the planning board. You were until recently on the planning board. What's the difference? Okay, now you're a historian, and you want to, think about like growth and the effects of the past on the present. What's the biggest difference in East Brunswick today than when you moved here in 1972, 49 years ago?
Yeah, a lot's changed. I mean, the property of the East Brunswick in the early 70s, there was a lot of residential development going on. There were There were new streets being put in, new developments. That pretty much tailed off in the 1980s and 90s. And most of the construction and development has been commercial and industrial in certain parts of town. A lot of the land that was available for development has been used up already. So there's not a lot of property that's available or large enough for any kind of a widespread development. So that era of East Brunswick is pretty much past. There's still some residential construction going up here and there, isolated streets and isolated houses. But the town fathers, decided a number of years ago that, there was enough residential development and they were going to concentrate on attracting more business to try to keep the tax rate down.
Right.
So
and we made a change recently. Okay. Because now every half century townships have to revision themselves. Right. So you've been involved in a lot of organizations in town. Okay.
Yeah.
And what drew you specifically to the East Brunswick Historical Society? And you're still in the building, right, located on Milltown Road?
Yeah. Shortly before I retired, I knew that I wanted to get myself involved in some community organizational work. I contacted the mayor at that time. That was Mayor Stoll, and he appointed me to the planning board. And then I got involved with the Historical Society because I'm a big history buff and a lover of history. I was a history major in college. And that was really my first choice. And they welcomed me very quickly because it's an organization that is always looking for new members. And I got to know the president, which was Estelle. It was Estelle Goldsmith. She was the founder. She was the founder of the Historical Society, along with a lady named Rose Sackle. They founded it back in the 1970s, in the early 70s.
Estelle Goldsmith is the patron saint of East Brunswick.
Oh, absolutely. And I got involved. I got to know Estelle, and she then appointed me to the Arts Commission, which I didn't really know, a great deal about, but they were looking for people also. So I got involved with that group through Estelle. But the Historical Society was really my first choice for involvement because I was very interested in history and the history of the town. And that was the organization. I wasn't even aware of the museum at that time, to be honest with you. But the Historical Society, definitely had room, and there was work to be done and things to be done. And they were in their new building. They were just in that building a short time. And that building was acquired basically because of Estelle's persistence in getting that property leased, to be able to be leased to the Historical Society. It's owned by the township, that building on Milltown Road, but they lease it on a long-term basis to the Historical Society. And so I got involved with the Historical Society in 2014. I became a member. And
let me ask you this now.
Yeah.
Let's get historical, okay?
Okay.
What are a few things about East Brunswick history in particular that you think it's important for residents to know that they might be interested in? I recently did some work with the museum regarding the governorship during the Lindbergh trials, and talked about a lot of those issues around that and stored materials. What are some things that the Historical Society wants people to know about East Brunswick's past?
Well, I don't know if you remember this, but last year, before the pandemic started, our last major program was the history of East Brunswick, which was done in two parts and was held at the Community Arts Center. And that history was really divided into three components. The first part was the very, very early history, where it was this area was inhabited by Native Americans and so forth, the very early settlers. And then the second part dealt with the history of the town until through the 19th and 20th centuries, up until about the early 50s. And then the period from 1951 through the present. Because until 1951, East Brunswick was essentially a farming community. It was developed at two ends, this northern end by the Raritan River, that's now known as the Lawrence Brook section, and the area down here where I live, which is closer to the South River, the what they used to call the Old Bridge section, the historic section off of Old Bridge Turnpike and Main Street. That's where the town developed on two ends. Everything in between was farms. But what happened to East Brunswick in the early 50s, as you may recall, the New Jersey Turnpike was built and it ran right through East Brunswick. And in 1951, that changed everything, because when the turnpike runs through your town, your entire community goes through a transformation, because now people can get on the turnpike and travel, commute to Newark or New York or other places. So in the 1950s, that was a turning point, transforming East Brunswick from a farming community to a suburban, industrial, residential town. And the plans, the way East Brunswick was developed was based on plans that were set up in the 1950s and 60s. Now that's now changing, but East Brunswick essentially until the 1950s was really just a sleepy farm town with all vegetable farmers, fruit farmers, growers of different type. It was a very quiet agrarian community.
Well, the Historical Society was right in the middle of a peach orchard, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, in the beginning, the Historical Society met in people's homes. When Estelle founded it, it was really, Maureen, it was really started as a woman's club. It was like where people got together for coffee and cake, and they sat around people's houses, and it started that way. They didn't have a home. That didn't happen until when Bill Neary became mayor, and the property on Milltown Road became available to the town. And mostly through Estelle's efforts, she convinced the mayor at that time, Mayor Neary, to allow that to become the residence of the Historical Society. He went along with it. But until then, there was no meeting place of the Historical Society. It met in people's houses. It was like a woman's. It was like a
women's club of East Brunswick, kind of like that. Yeah.
Right. It was a women's club, and then that changed, and so we're in, we're in a somewhat of a different situation as far as the Historical Society. I mean, they say every 25 years a town turns over, its population turns over, and that's what's happening now. The demographics of East Brunswick are changing. New people are coming in, new families, different people. It's still largely a commuting town, as it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but a lot of the residents from that time have moved away and are being replaced with younger people, newer people.
So we have in East Brunswick a historical society and a museum corporation. Yes. Can you tell us what's the difference, and do people work together? What's the focus of each of those groups?
Yeah, Maureen, that's a question that comes up, and we're asked that all the time by members of the public whenever we meet East Brunswick Day. Yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot, and it's really the answer is this: the museum, the function of the museum, They store and collect artifacts from the history of this town. They collect books, clothing, furniture, artwork, memorabilia. People donate things. Sometimes if an old resident dies, the family will donate items that are considered to have some historical value. So the museum is basically what the word is. This stuff is put on display, and people go visit the museum, and it's open on the weekends, or at least it was open on the weekends. I'm not sure what their hours are now, and people can tour it. It's located on Maple Street in East Brunswick, which is over in the historic district, and that building is housed numerous artifacts, papers, documents, maps, furniture, old equipment, sewing machines, and old radios and things like that. So that's an actual working museum. And they also have functions, also serve as an art museum where art that's done by prominent people is displayed there. That's the function of the museum. The function of the Historical Society is completely different. We're more of an educational organization. We do programs, we do lectures, we hire speakers, we have people coming in to talk about local history and the history of the state of New Jersey. It's not a society that gets involved in American history per se. We try to keep it local and related to New Jersey.
What are some recent programs that were there before the pandemic? I remember that there was a speaker series very recently, and there's been ongoing things to pique interest, but also to commemorate the anniversaries of occasions.
Yeah, well, we had a big program in March of 2020, which was the history of East Brunswick, which was very well attended, and it was held out at the Community Arts Center. Now we have programs at our building, but our building, which is the old Smith farmhouse, that's a historic building in itself. That only holds about 35 people. So if we're going to have a program that we think is going to have more than that, we'll have it at the Arts Center or at the library. But we had programs in 2018. We did a program on World War I, which was the 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I.
Excellent program.
Yeah, that was an excellent program. A few years ago, a program was done on World War II. We've had speakers speaking of history. We had some history professors speaking about the American Revolution and how specifically we had a lecture in which the professor stated that the two battles in New Jersey determined the outcome of the American Revolution, the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. We were losing the American Revolution until those two battles. We were getting beaten by the British. After those two battles, which the Americans won, the tide turned. So that was a very interesting program. We've had speakers on the Civil War. It's interesting. The Civil War draws a lot of people, and there are people who are Civil War speakers. They're experts, and they come dressed in their military uniforms, and they bring weapons and the typical soldiers' gear that was worn during the Civil War. So we've had a couple of programs on that, I think in 2017, and we've also done. We did a program on the first railroad. The first working railroad in the United States was the Camden Amboy Railroad, that was built in 1834, 1835, and it ran from Perth Amboy down to Trenton and then to Camden. And we got
What? You could go east to west in New Jersey?
Yeah,
You can only go north and south in New Jersey. It is impossible to go east and west in New
yeah,
Jersey. Imagine traveling today from South Amboy or Perth Amboy to Camden. That's a diagonal line straight across the widest part of the state, right? So, I mean, that shows you that it was farmland because there was nothing in between those two
no, I
locations.
mean, those tracks are still in existence, and they are off of Bordentown Avenue and and Main Street in East Brunswick, and then it cuts through Spotswood and then goes from there. It's not. There's no active passenger traffic anymore. I think it was abandoned in the 1950s, and there used to be a train station there called the Old Bridge train station, opposite where the Alice DeVoe Library is. That's where the train station. Now it's a professional building. So we had a program on the history of that railroad, which actually brought out a lot of people. I didn't realize that many people were interested in railroads. But
railroad's a big thing in New Jersey. If you look at the old train sites, that's something that people are interested in. You said you were interested in history. What are things particularly, in and around and beyond East Brunswick that, brought you to study history? I'm kind of a New Jersey obsessed person. And, to come from an urban area up in Northern Jersey and then come here to this very suburban area in the 60s and 70s, what was it that got you interested in history?
Well, it goes back to, middle school and high school. I mean, I discovered I was good in history. I was not good in math and science. And I was a fairly decent history student. And then I pursued it in college because I just loved it. I just loved the subject. And I was doing well in it, and I think everybody finds their own niche, what they're good at and what they're not good at. So I was good in history and probably would have been a history teacher if I could have earned enough of a living at it. But, when I came out of college, the average salary of a teacher in New Jersey was about $7,000 a year.
Pretty much that today.
In 1968. So, I mean, at that point, it wasn't feasible for a career for me. So I wound up going to law school instead. But, I always retained my interest in history. And, I'm a heavy reader of it and still do. I belong to a couple of history book clubs and so forth. And some of them are online now, but
what have you read recently that was interesting to you historically?
Well, I've read, I read a lot of 20th century history, the history of, World War II, Nazi Germany, and the rise of fascism, and finished a book on Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. I've read biographies of Truman. And I just got one on George Marshall, former Secretary of State and Defense. And I like the period from 1900, up to the present. That's the area that I'm most interested in. So
does that inform, how does the Historical Society come up with programming? You say, okay, now 2018, right, was really a year they had events at Princeton, they had events everywhere to commemorate the end of World War I and its impact on the local community. I went to a funeral service for all the Princeton graduates because Princeton University was a training ground for officers in World War I. And so that time period generated the programming at Princeton. In the East Brunswick Historical Society, as we move out of this pandemic, kind of what's ahead and how does it get decided on, what's going to be the focus?
Well, the Historical Society is at a point now where, well, to answer your question about programming, we have meetings once a month. And one of the committee chairmen is the programming chairman. I was programming chairman until 2020, when I became vice president. Someone else is now programming chairman. And what the programming chairman does is he makes suggestions to the membership at a meeting about programs to see if the members approve of it and think it's worthwhile. Because we want to pick subjects and topics that are going to draw people, and would be of interest to people. So we sit and discuss that at a meeting, and then we plan out number one, how many programs we're going to have in the course of the year, because it takes time. You can't do a program every month. You got to prepare for it. You got to advertise it. You got to make up posters. There's a lot of things that have to be done. And the program chairman then contacts, let's suppose we want to do a program on one of the things we were considering was a program on Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's a woman, an actress that portrays her
one woman show
program.
kind of thing.
Yeah, puts on a one woman show. So we would contact these people or a speaker. Many times they're experts in the field, and find out what their availability is and how much they charge. And then if it's agreeable, then they're booked in for a particular date. And we usually you start in the beginning of the year and do so many programs in the spring and then so many in the fall. We do about, prior to the pandemic, we were doing about 6 to 8 programs a year. But, you know, it's a group consensus that meets to discuss the different suggestions and to find out what's doable and what's not doable.
Well, in addition, I'm sorry.
No, and then we find out what the cost of the program is, what our expenses are going to be, and whether or not it's affordable. And then we contact the speakers.
Does every year have a focus? Like, let's say 2018, the focus was on the end of World War, the centennial of World War I, and then a few episodes having to do with local folks. You said this started as a women's group. Are there things about, the history of suffrage? Do you have a theme for the year, or do you put on programs that, are of high interest or good quality that you think, kind of will appeal to a variety of folks?
No, we don't have a theme for the year. In other words, each program could be different. If we're doing 6 programs, they could be completely different and unrelated. We try to pick programs that involve local history or New Jersey history. We don't do programs on the opening of the West or anything like that.
Right.
It has to be something that we think people in the area would be interested in. And sometimes, there's a debate that goes on at the society about what programs are going to draw people, because we don't want to have a program in which 10 people show up. We want to have a program that would be interesting to people. And believe it or not, programs on war bring people out. Mm-hmm. And programs, believe it or not, on crime issues. We had a program on a famous murder case that came out of New Jersey, the whole Mills murder case. And there are several people who are experts on that particular subject. It's a case that was the actual crime took place in the early 1920s, and the case was never solved. So that brought out a lot of people. Things involving crime and sex and war, not necessarily in that order.
If you can get all 3 together, that would be great, right? That's a real draw, Well, the whole Mills case involved the Johnson family of Johnson & Johnson.
Right.
The Hall family lived on the campus of what is now, and donated that campus of what now is right. Douglas. I know I taught that case many, many years to my students because it was an unsolved case, so they could write and learn whatever they wanted about it, and it was an interesting thing. Yeah. All right, so moving forward, all right, what do you think, what's something that you would like to see the Historical Society, you personally, Howard, what's something that you are interested in that would be, even if it has this, war, sex, violence, crime thing going on. I know as a journalist that draws people too, but that's not always, playing to the highest, esoteric thought. But what is something that people need to know in addition to our history as a rural community, growing into a suburban community, now growing into a transportation community, since you're on the planning board and you know about the redevelopment and the idea of East Brunswick expanding its ability to provide housing for people who do want to go back and forth to other places to work. What's something you think that the historical society could remind people of, or within their programming, that will help us think about the progress of East Brunswick?
See, I would like to do more. I see. I mean, you mentioned the redevelopment and so forth. I mean, the town is in a period of transition right now. It's having growing pains to the extent that the mayor and council are trying to move the town in a different direction, in a 21st century direction. Some people agree with it, some people don't agree with it. Time will tell if the decisions being made are correct. I mean, one of the areas that I'd like to get into, and it's difficult, is this. There were people who settled this town. There was a whole group of farmers and agrarian people who settled this town in the early years of the 20th century. Some of those families still exist in this town. I think it's important to know, where did this town actually come from? Who settled it? Who were the people that owned all the land here? What happened to it? How did the farms, all the farmers, sell out to developers? And the problem is, who's actually still around that knows this? Because many of the original farmers have died, and their children and grandchildren have to be contacted, which I think is something that I'd like to see us do, because we would need the cooperation of these people to do a program, because they're the only folks that actually know what happened in this town. I mean, we have photos and journals from people from the 1930s and 40s, when there was all farms on Cranberry Road and Milltown Road and so forth. But it would be nice, before it's too late, to tell the story of how the town got to that point and then switched into another direction. And where are those families? There's still some farmers left, but not a lot.
Not a lot. No, more and more.
So we have to reach out to the descendants of these people, and some of them are still around. This is a project that is going to require some work, because we're going to have to get these people in, because we ourselves don't have enough knowledge, or
you don't have the firsthand knowledge, right?
Yeah, that's right. So that's a project that I would like to see happen in the Historical Society in the coming months or years. But we've talked about it, and the feeling is that we want to do it. But with the pandemic, everything was placed on hold, so we really have.
Sure, yeah, it was. But I mean, it's really an interesting thing, because you're talking about people who are still alive, who can tell those stories firsthand. The people after whom our schools are named, the people after whom our roads are named. What
That's
happened
right.
there, what was there before the mall. Thank you for sharing your time with us today, Howard Schmidt from the East Brunswick Historical Society over there, and where there used to be a lot of peaches on Milltown Road.
Yeah,
and peaches and apples.
Yeah,
we still have a few
apple
farms left in town. I want to thank you for sharing your time and your perspective on putting keeping us, as we move to the future, informed about the past and where those two lines intersect to make the present. Thanks a lot, Howard.
Thanks, Maureen. Appreciate your having me, and I'm glad I could help out.